November 1944. The Pacific War was reaching its brutal climax. American submarines prowled the dark waters around Japan like silent predators, searching for targets that could turn the tide of this massive conflict. But on one cold evening, a young submarine commander was about to stumble upon the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to sink the largest aircraft carrier ever built, a floating fortress that the Japanese believed was unsinkable. Commander Joseph Enright stood in the conning tower of the USS Archerfish, scanning the horizon with tired eyes. He had been at sea for weeks, and so far, this patrol had been frustratingly quiet. Too quiet. His crew was restless, eager for action after days of monotonous searching. The submarine cut through the waves south of Tokyo Bay, its diesel engines rumbling as it recharged batteries on the surface under cover of darkness. Enright was a man carrying a heavy burden. Earlier that year, he had been given a golden opportunity to sink a Japanese carrier during a previous patrol, but he had hesitated, second-guessed his firing solution, and watched helplessly as the massive ship steamed away unharmed. That failure haunted him. His superiors had seriously considered relieving him of command. Only his proven competence in other areas had saved his career, but the shame of that missed opportunity burned in his chest every single day. Now, as November 28th turned into November 29th, Enright had no idea that fate was about to give him a second chance, one that would write his name into naval history forever. The Archerfish was a Below-class submarine, one of America's most advanced underwater hunters. At 311 feet long and displacing over 1,500 tons when submerged, she was armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a crew of 80 men who had trained together until they could operate in near-total darkness. These men lived in cramped quarters that smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and recycled air. They ate canned food, slept in shifts, and went weeks without seeing sunlight. But they were volunteers, every one of them, and they believed in their mission. On the evening of November 28th, Archerfish was running on the surface, making good speed as she patrolled her assigned area. The sea was calm, the sky overcast. Visibility was poor, which was both a blessing and a curse. It made them harder to spot, but it also made finding targets more difficult. Around 8:45 p.m., the radar operator called out a contact. Enright rushed to check the scope. Multiple targets, moving fast, roughly 30 miles away. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a lone merchant vessel or a small patrol boat. This was something big, something important, traveling with escorts. The Japanese had indeed sent something extraordinary into these waters. The Shinano was no ordinary aircraft carrier. Originally laid down as the third Yamato-class battleship, she had been converted mid-construction into an aircraft carrier after the devastating Japanese losses at the Battle of Midway in 1942. At 72,000 tons fully loaded and stretching 872 feet in length, she was the largest carrier ever built up to that point. Her flight deck was armored with 8 inches of steel. Her hull was compartmentalized into hundreds of watertight sections. Japanese engineers had designed her to withstand multiple torpedo and bomb hits. They called her unsinkable. But Shinano had a fatal weakness that her crew didn't fully understand. She was sailing to the Kure naval base for final fitting out, but she was leaving Tokyo Bay prematurely. Her watertight doors weren't all properly tested. Many of her compartments still had openings where equipment would eventually be installed. Construction materials, welding equipment, and civilian workers' tools still cluttered her passageways. She was a giant still learning to walk, and she had been forced into the water before she was ready. Captain Toshio Abe commanded Shinano. He was an experienced officer, but he had received urgent orders to move his ship immediately. American B-29 bombers had been pounding Tokyo, and Naval Command feared the massive carrier might be destroyed while still in port. So on November 28th, despite Abe's misgivings, Shinano departed with an escort of 3 destroyers, Isokes, Hamikes, and Yukikes. The plan was to make a high-speed run south to Kure under cover of darkness. Aboard Archerfish, Enright was making rapid calculations. The contact was moving at 20 knots, very fast for a cargo ship or tanker. This had to be a warship, probably a significant one given the escort pattern. But what kind of warship? A battleship? A cruiser? He couldn't tell yet, and he couldn't risk surfacing for a better look with those destroyers nearby. The fundamental problem facing Enright was geometry. His submarine could make 17 knots on the surface, maybe 9 knots submerged. The target was doing 20 knots and would soon be even faster. The Japanese were zigzagging, changing course every few minutes to throw off any submarine attack. For Enright to intercept, he would have to predict where the target would be, position his submarine along that path, and hope his calculations were correct. For the next several hours, Archerfish ran on the surface at maximum speed, paralleling the Japanese formation, trying to work ahead of them. The crew was at battle stations, every man tense and ready. In the control room, Enright hunched over the navigation table with his executive officer, constantly updating their position and the target's projected course. The radar kept feeding them data, but the contact would occasionally disappear as the Japanese zigged away, only to reappear minutes later. Come on, Enright muttered, watching the plot. They were burning fuel fast, racing through the night, but they were slowly, painfully slowly, gaining position. The engineers in the engine room pushed the diesels to their limits, the machinery roaring as it drove the submarine forward through the dark swells. Around midnight, Enright made a critical decision. The Japanese were heading generally south-southwest. If they maintained that base course, there was a point where Archerfish could submerge ahead of them and wait in ambush. It was a gamble. If the Japanese zigged too far off course, Archerfish would miss them entirely. But if Enright guessed right, he would have his shot. At 12:30 a.m. on November 29th, Archerfish crash-dived ahead of the approaching formation. The klaxons sounded throughout the boat. Men scrambled to their diving stations. Valves opened with a roar, flooding the ballast tanks. The submarine's bow tilted down sharply as she slipped beneath the waves. In less than a minute, Archerfish was at periscope depth, silent and invisible, lying in wait like a predator in tall grass. Now came the hardest part, waiting. In a submerged submarine, running silent, every sound seems amplified. The crew could hear the ping of Japanese sonar from the destroyers, an eerie metallic echo that sent chills down every spine. They could hear the thrum of distant propellers growing louder, closer. Enright stood at the periscope, rotating it slowly, searching the darkness for any sign of his target. And then he saw her. Through the periscope's narrow field of view, an absolutely massive shape emerged from the gloom. Enright's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a cruiser. This wasn't even a battleship. This was an aircraft carrier, and she was enormous, far larger than any carrier he had ever seen. Her island superstructure towered above the water. Her flight deck seemed to stretch on forever. Jesus Christ! Enright whispered. His hands were shaking on the periscope handles. This was it. This was his redemption. But he had to be perfect. One mistake, one miscalculation, and this Leviathan would steam past him into history. The problem was the geometry of the attack. Shinano was doing 20 knots, zigzagging every 10 minutes or so. The three destroyers were sweeping back and forth ahead of her, their sonar pinging constantly. Enright had to fire his torpedoes from a position where they would still hit even if Shinano zigged at the last moment. He needed what submariners called a small angle on the bow, catching the target moving nearly directly toward or away from him, where a zigzag wouldn't throw off the solution too much. But Shinano wasn't cooperating. She was moving at a 45-degree angle to Archerfish, a terrible angle for a shot. Enright's torpedoes were the Mark 14, which had been plagued with problems earlier in the war: faulty depth keeping, dud warheads, defective magnetic exploders. Many of those issues had been fixed by late 1944, but submariners had long memories and little trust in their weapons. Enright needed to make absolutely certain of his setup. For 30 agonizing minutes, Enright tracked Shinano, waiting for the right moment. The range was opening. Soon she would be too far away. His executive officer, Lieutenant Andrews, was calling out ranges and bearings, his voice steady despite the tension. The torpedo data computer was humming, calculating angles and speeds. Every man in the boat knew what was at stake. Finally, at 3:17 a.m., Shinano executed a zig that brought her bow around. She was now heading almost directly toward Archerfish from about 1,400 yards away. It wasn't a perfect angle, but it was close enough. Enright's window was closing fast. "Final bearing and shoot!" Enright ordered, his voice suddenly calm with decision. The first torpedo roared out of Tube 1 with a jolt that shook the entire submarine. Then Tube 2. Then 3. Then 4. 6 torpedoes in total left Archerfish, each one racing through the water at 46 knots, each one set to run at 10 feet depth, each one aimed at different points along Shinano's massive hull to ensure that at least some would hit even if she maneuvered. In the control room, the crew counted seconds. 47 seconds per 1,000 yards at this torpedo speed. The weight was excruciating. Enright kept his eye glued to the periscope, watching Shinano's dark bulk. Then he saw it, a bright flash amidships, followed by a thunderous explosion that they could hear clearly through the hull. Another flash. Another explosion. 3 hits, maybe 4. Massive columns of water erupted along Shinano's starboard side. Through the periscope, Enright could see the great ship shudder from the impacts. "Hit! Hit! Hit!" Men were shouting throughout the submarine. Years of training and discipline momentarily forgotten in the rush of success. Enright allowed himself a tight smile, but there was no time to celebrate. The destroyers would be coming for them now, and they would be angry. "Take her deep! Rig for depth charges! All ahead full!" Archerfish's bow nosed down steeply as she drove for the safety of deep water. Behind them, the sounds of breaking up and confused activity echoed through the sea. The Japanese destroyers were indeed coming, their screws thrashing the water as they raced to where they had seen the torpedo wakes. For the next several hours, Archerfish endured a relatively light depth charging. The Japanese destroyers seemed disorganized, distracted. What Enright didn't know was that Captain Abe had made a fatal decision. Convinced that Shinano could survive a few torpedo hits, after all, she was designed to be unsinkable, Abe ordered his ship to maintain course and speed toward Kure. He didn't want to lose time, didn't want to stop and assess damage. He believed his engineers when they told him the flooding was under control. But 4 Mark 14 torpedoes had struck Shinano's starboard side in a well-spaced pattern. The explosions had blown enormous holes in her hull. Water was pouring into her compartments at a catastrophic rate. And because of those incomplete watertight doors, because of those temporary openings, because of the construction materials jamming hatches open, the water didn't stay contained. It spread through corridor after corridor, flooding compartment after compartment. Shinano's damage control parties worked frantically, but they were overwhelmed. The ship began to list. Her speed dropped. Captain Abe finally realized the horrible truth: his ship was dying. At dawn, he ordered the destroyers to come alongside to take off non-essential personnel. Young sailors and civilian workers scrambled across in the growing light, many of them looking back at the tilting giant with disbelief. How could something so massive, so strong, be sinking? By 10:18 a.m. on November 29, 1944, less than 7 hours after Archerfish's torpedoes struck home, Shinano rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the waves. She took with her 1,435 men, including Captain Abe, who chose to go down with his ship. The largest aircraft carrier ever built had survived less than 20 hours at sea. Aboard Archerfish, now running deep and quiet, Enright and his crew had no idea of the magnitude of their success. They knew they had hit something big, but in the confusion of the attack and the subsequent evasion, they couldn't be sure what it was or whether it had actually sunk. Navy regulations required confirmation, but Enright wasn't about to surface in those hostile waters to check. He set course for Guam, where Archerfish was due to end her patrol. When Archerfish pulled into Upper Harbor in Guam 2 weeks later, Enright submitted his patrol report claiming to have torpedoed and possibly sunk a large carrier. His superiors were skeptical. Japanese carriers were rare targets by late 1944, most had already been sunk. The intelligence officers combed through radio intercepts and reconnaissance reports but could find no confirmation. Enright was credited with damaging an unidentified large vessel, but not a confirmed kill. It wasn't until after the war, when American investigators interviewed Japanese survivors and examined naval records, that the full truth emerged. The USS Archerfish had indeed sunk an aircraft carrier. Not just any carrier, but the Shinano, the largest carrier ever built. It remains to this day the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. For Commander Joseph Enright, it was vindication beyond measure. The man who had been given a second chance had made the most of it. He received the Navy Cross, America's second highest decoration for valor. His crew received a Presidential Unit Citation. But more than medals, Enright had reclaimed his honor and proven to himself that he could perform under the most intense pressure imaginable. The sinking of Shinano was a devastating blow to Japanese morale. They had invested enormous resources into building this supposedly unsinkable supercarrier, only to lose her on her maiden voyage. It was a symbol of Japan's crumbling industrial and military power in the face of American dominance. The Japanese Navy had begun the war with 10 aircraft carriers. By the end of 1944, they had lost all of them to American submarines, aircraft, and warships. For the men of Archerfish, the patrol became the stuff of legend. They had achieved what every submarine crew dreamed of, sinking a major enemy capital ship. The boat itself received a large banner painted with a Japanese carrier and the notation, "Largest warship sunk by a submarine." Archerfish continued to serve through the end of the war, completing several more patrols, though none as dramatic as that November night in 1944. The lessons of Shinano's loss were studied intensively by both navies. For the Japanese, it underscored the danger of rushing major warships to sea before they were truly ready. For the Americans, it validated their submarine strategy of aggressive patrol close to enemy home waters. The Pacific Submarine Campaign, which included boats like Archerfish, ultimately destroyed the majority of Japan's merchant marine and a significant portion of her navy. It was one of the most successful submarine campaigns in history. Commander Enright went on to have a distinguished career, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. He never forgot that night in November 1944, when he stood at the periscope and watched his torpedoes strike home. In later years, he spoke respectfully of Captain Abe and the men who died aboard Shinano. There was no joy in the killing, only the grim satisfaction of duty performed and objectives achieved. War, Enright would say, was a terrible thing, but when your nation calls, you answer. The wreck of Shinano was discovered in 2019, lying in over 4,000 feet of water south of Japan. Underwater imagery showed the massive hull broken and deteriorating, but still recognizable. It stands as a monument to the men who served aboard her, and to the brutal mathematics of naval warfare, where the largest, strongest ship can still fall to a smaller, smarter opponent who strikes at the right moment with determination and skill. And somewhere in those waters, perhaps there's an echo of USS Archerfish, the little submarine that killed a giant and wrote her name in the history books forever.